Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Dan Laletta. I'm here with Tom Deans, and Kevin Prater, my partner, will be joining us shortly. We're going to be talking today about the top 6 estate planning ideas that successful families master. Our guest speaker today, Dr. Deans, has delivered more than 1,000 keynote speeches in 26 countries. And we'll be talking about the importance of estate planning in light of our current global crisis. If you've seen Dr. Deans on CBC or BNN, you'll know that he delivers a fast-paced, entertaining, and informative message that you won't want to miss. Some of the things we hope that you come away with today: avoid some of the biggest and most expensive estate planning mistakes. Begin the process of preparing beneficiaries. Bring transparency to estate plans and how to select the right executor. Personally, I had met Dr. Deans, Tom, about a decade ago? I think we were just talking. I belong to a group, the Legacy Group out of Boston, and they had brought you in to talk about your unique way of presenting this material to small business owners and your unique qualifications to do that. I know I was always very impressed with your presentations. Of course, yeah, I'm easily impressed, right? Dr. Deans has spent a lot of time, not only with myself, but with the Legacy Group, in helping us be more qualitative than quantitative. In other words, to talk about visions and values, not just, where's your money and where's it going to go. Do you remember that, Tom? Do you remember those meetings?
Well, Dan, first of all, thank you. I'm really, thank you for inviting me today. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. And I do remember that. I was so excited to be, first of all, going to Chicago, because I knew that Legacy group of advisors had really invested in advanced planning. And as you said, it's not just how to sell. It's actually the opposite. It's how to engage, how to understand people's values and help them understand their own values. And then to start these family conversations so that wealth can be created and it's given purpose and context, right? There's no sense just making more and more and more and not giving any thought to how that will impact people's lives. So I just remember being in Chicago thinking, really, this is going to be the key to the beginning of an amazing journey. And of course it was. So many legacy advisors like yourself have engaged me all across America to bring this message to communities, big and small, to start these important conversations. And then along comes COVID, another 8 years later, and the world is thrust into total chaos. And estate planning and business succession planning goes from priority 125 in people's lives. No one really wants to talk about this stuff, to really one of the top 3 things that keep people awake at night. So I'm really excited to bring the message to your community today. And I know, as I said, we got a lot of ground to cover. So maybe we can dive in.
Yes, we can. Kevin has joined us. Just a quick bio of myself. I've been doing this for almost 4 decades now. And going back to what you were just stating, the whole idea of not selling, but more coaching and bringing out those values so that when people make decisions, they make them based off of who they are, not just what the magic bullet of the day is. So the title of today's webinar is the top 6 estate planning ideas that successful families master. Can you briefly list the top 6 to give our attendees an overview of what we'll be covering today?
Yeah, absolutely. So they are very quickly healthcare, which sounds a little bit odd when you're thinking about estate planning, because we always think of estate planning as just being something that happens when we die. So how could healthcare possibly fit into that? But it really does, and we're going to spend a little time on that. Healthcare, taxes, litigation, families are, oh my gosh, the courts all across the country are full of families fighting. So we're going to talk about that. Communication sounds easy. It is hard to talk about money. It's always been hard to talk about money with our children, or children talking with their parents, or increasingly grandparents about money. So we're going to be talking about in communication, a couple of tips and tricks on how that can go smoothly. And of course, planning. there are still tens of millions of Americans who do not have planners. They don't understand the importance of seriously having a decent plan, not a perfect plan. There's no such thing as a perfect plan, but a plan that just gets a little bit better every year by leaning on experts like yourself. And then finally, the sixth one, governance. Understanding that when we create wealth, we actually have a duty to ourselves and our families and our community to have really good governance, really good rules, structure, legal structures to help that wealth transition, or that business, we're going to talk about that too, transition in a way that releases potential in the next generation. So yeah, healthcare, taxes, litigation, communication, planning, and governance are the big six that we're going to cover today.
Perfect. I appreciate that, Tom. And it's very interesting to me that one of the first things you talk about is healthcare. So I'm assuming you're talking about healthcare planning in the sense of powers of attorney, that kind of thing. Could you expound on that a little bit, especially during the pandemic?
Absolutely. So I don't know anyone who has a healthcare proxy, a living will, a healthcare power of attorney, whatever you want to call it. It is that document that empowers typically family to make decisions when we lose capacity, right? Make decisions about our healthcare. I don't know anyone who has one of those who actually doesn't have a will. In other words, we go in for the will, right, and we come out with the two bonus documents: financial power of attorney and healthcare power of attorney. Those. Right. So healthcare, it's a big part of estate planning. If we don't have that healthcare power of attorney, and we're in a hospital on a ventilator, or in a hospital because we've been in a car accident, or for whatever scenario, we find ourselves unable to communicate. What does that look like? With their family out in the hallway of the hospital, debating, fighting, trying to figure out what the right course of action is. It seldom goes well. And that is often the very first step of dysfunction that we see playing out in family members while an aging parent or grandparent is nearing death. And it is expensive and anguishing. There is so much heartbreak. And what I think is so troubling is that these documents cost hundreds of dollars, not tens of thousands of dollars.
Right.
It's a little bit of time and a tiny amount of money to make sure that our family avoids a huge amount of chaos and, of course, litigation, which we're going to talk about in a moment.
Sure.
Hey Tom, with the healthcare piece, the other part of this comes into play, especially with business owners and really any family, is to look at the standpoint of diminished capacity. In other words, how, from your experience in business, when you have a business leader that is showing diminished capacity, then, that document you talked about often doesn't set all the triggers on how to protect the business against somebody that's clearly showing diminished capacity in their role. Can you comment a little bit on what you've experienced on that?
Well, no question. I mean, if you look at some of the stats, business owners are actually living longer than any other generation of business owners. That comes with a little bit of a downside. We're living longer, and cognitive impairment is a serious problem. We always think of incapacity as someone's been hit by a bus. There's that cognitive piece, right, where the business owner who hasn't done any business transition planning, they are finding that people around them are starting to see some clues that things aren't making sense. Decisions are being made kind of impetuous or poor decisions. So these documents at least give a family a roadmap, right, to begin conversations and ultimately protect the business owner from themselves.
Right.
So it takes great introspection for a business owner to say, I don't need one of those now, but maybe one day I do. And when that day comes, I will have anticipated that day and empowered people to protect me, to serve me.
Right.
That's a long way away from estate planning is about a will, which answers the question, who gets my barbecue and my boat and my car when I'm dead, right?
Right.
That's what people think that this is. That's not what well, sure, we'll talk about that. But we're talking about how these documents can help us while we're still alive. But as we age, especially if we have accumulated wealth, surplus wealth, homes, cars, vacation properties, businesses, it's an increasing problem with the most, I mean, we're aging, right? The leading edge of the baby boomers are turning 75 this year, and they are business owners. They created more businesses than any other generation, and they created more wealth than any generation, and they're going to live longer than any generation. It's the big three coming together to create this perfect storm, which is why, I don't know, I just think people should acknowledge the gift that you're bringing to your community. There's not a lot of people talking about this stuff because there's really not a lot of money being made by attorneys writing wills, financial power of attorneys, and healthcare directors. It's not a lucrative part of their practice, right? So, and it's not something that happens on its own. And we've covered this in previous webinars where we talk about that shocking statistic. 127 million American adults don't have a will. And half of all business owners in your community don't have a will. So the state's waiting. The state has a nifty little plan for dividing up that business owner's business or their wealth according to that state formula. And I will bet that the decision that the state has in mind, the little formula they have in mind, is not going to be the same as what the business owner has in mind. So it's just bringing this urgency and really education around this subject. So important.
Well, the one thing too, Tom, is that people don't realize, as my kids point out to me every day, the cognitive issues are subtle. It's not one day you wake up and forget what your name is. Okay. We all have these moments of, why did I come into this room? What was it I was going to get? Those kind of things. As age progresses, cognitive issues come up. Deterioration starts to happen just naturally. And I think people need to realize that you want to do this while you're on your game. This is not something that you want to take advantage of on your deathbed or while you've been told that you have an issue. Yeah. You want to be able to think about it. And again, that comes to your idea of planning, is to make sure you're doing this ahead of time and not behind. And people should realize that leaving big decisions to people who are unprepared to make those decisions is almost cruel. And that's what we really want to talk about, is families dumping these things on people who just are not ready to handle them quite yet. Not that they can't, but they're just not ready. So.
Yeah, it's an excellent point you make. And in fact, what's so interesting about this subject is that if there is some degree of cognitive impairment and someone then decides, even in an imperfect state, that they want to begin their estate plan, and then in the fullness of time, if someone isn't happy with what they got, like maybe the business owner leaves the business to his favorite son or the eldest boy and not to his daughters, right? Well, someone is going to be unhappy with that decision. And if that will is being written while there is some evidence of cognitive impairment, that the courts are going to kick that document. The courts are going to say that document was drafted when someone either had undue influence or lacked capacity to make that will. So what's so interesting about this subject is, if you leave it too late, you're running enormous risks if someone feels like they're aggrieved from the decisions you make in that state of mind.
No, that's perfectly said. And one other component to this is, we all assume if we're in with a spouse, that one thing is going to happen to somebody and then something is going to happen to somebody else in succession. And when we plan, we always talk about, we in planning, we kill the male spouse first, right? That's just polite thing to do, in your planning scenario. But in all reality, you have occasions right now, going on right now, where both parents and business owners are in the same state of decline at the same time. And, it creates a whole huge set of circumstances regarding their estate and other decisions that have to be made. And it just multiplies the complications. So I think, you starting out with healthcare is such an important topic, because it affects all aspects of the responsible parties, generation, to help mom and dad or brother and sister or sibling or whatever it is. grandparents, aunt and uncle through this time. But when you have other assets to manage, businesses, employees, just wealth in general, it complicates things. So dealing with the healthcare side of it is definitely should be a priority. I think maybe even the first priority.
We have just a limited amount of time, so I'm going to switch just real quick, Tom, from the healthcare part of this to talk about that. It really doesn't surprise anyone that estate taxes are something successful families want to avoid and try not to pay. Nobody wants to pay the government more than they have to. They want to keep the money within the family. You have a unique and interesting way of talking to families about how to avoid big mistakes. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I do. And avoid big tax mistakes. And that is, so the real, what we know from estate planning, you've been in the business for 4 decades, so you will know exactly what I'm talking about. You have seen families, like really successful, smart business owners, for example, start a business from nothing, like literally with nothing, build it, scale it, lots of employees. And you're thinking, well, they're smart. Like they're clearly smart, hardworking, driven people. And then they do something very peculiar when it comes to the transition of wealth. And I'll give you a hint. Yeah, nothing. Nothing. Total silence. They're obviously proud of what they built, but they feel so ill-equipped to talk to the next generation about what they built. So they wrap their plans, and especially their tax liability, in secrecy. Money continues to be such an off-limit conversation, right? Just somehow if you ignore it, it'll go away, or somehow everything will work out in the end, or somehow you'll know when the perfect day arrives and you'll find the energy and the courage to bring your family together with your advisor present and have a family meeting and start to prepare the next generation for what is coming their way, as opposed to I die and then surprise. Right. The word surprise shouldn't be surprising, but the vast majority of Americans who inherit have no idea what's coming their way. They either vastly underestimate, which is tragic because they haven't done their own savings, they don't have insurance, like they're just hoping for a big gift and it doesn't happen, or equally tragic, someone dies and the floodgates open and they're like, holy smokes, what am I going to do with that? I had no idea mom and dad had that much money. Right. And both scenarios can destroy family, can destroy people's just lives. I mean, it's just like a sudden lottery win. Like we think that, just getting lots of money, it would be just awesome and everyone's prepared for that and everything will go smoothly. Tragic. So today, just over $2 billion will be inherited today, tomorrow, and every day for the next 10 years. Yep. The most affluent generation are dying and they are leaving huge amounts of wealth. Most of it, surprise.
Mm-hmm. I can remember too, growing up, my father always saying, or when someone asked him how much money he made, that kind of thing, he's like, well, just like my right to vote, I don't have to tell you. When you're a business owner, that's part of the plan. That's where we get into the vision and values. Okay. Money is not something to keep secret. Wealth is not something to keep secret. It is something to manage just like any other asset. And I think once that gets ingrained in people, we get away from this idea of let's not talk about what we have. Okay. You're not putting up a billboard. And you're going to talk about this in a little bit, but the family governance is where we come into actually educating people about money. And it's just not been a topic. And you know that from our school systems where they don't even teach you how to balance a checkbook. Right. Okay. We never talk about money. Okay. Right. But if it's part of your vision, part of your values, and it's what makes this particular operation run, it needs to be talked about. Yeah. And it's amazing that they didn't. But, it's obvious that successful families avoid estate litigation. And that's a big expense. But your solution for accomplishing this is a bit counterintuitive. Can you share a little bit about your thoughts?
Yeah, and again, I'm speaking from personal experience. So I'm 59 years old. I've been to 55, 54, 54, 55 family meetings in a row, consecutive meetings. So I just grew up in a family where we had facilitated family meetings. We gathered once a year and we talked about this stuff. And I go right back to, the late 1960s. We're sitting in a room with my grandparents and my parents, and I just remember all this discussion, and for years and years, it made no sense. It was just gibberish. And then at some point, my brother and I would kind of piece together what was going on. And that's the culture that we grew up with. Like, there's a lot of people who think there's a magic. So I was 5 years old, if you want to do the math. So there's a lot of people who think there's a magic number, 10, 15, 25. Like, I ask people, when do you think you would want to start these conversations with your kids? And it's always 25, 30, 35, sometimes 40, I hear, but it's never 26, 28, 33, 39. It's always increments of 5, just like business owners are going to sell their business in 5 years. I come back a year later, it's not 4, it's always 5, always 5, always 5, always 5. It's like, so my point that I'm trying to make in my book, Willing Wisdom, is this idea that it's never too early.
Right.
It's never too early, especially when you have family meetings and you talk about the importance of confidentiality and creating a sense that we were attending something very special and unique. But we always underscored the idea that it's important that what happened in that family meeting stayed in that room, and that kind of is a value, right? The secrecy was built on mutual trust and respect, using the idea of inherited wealth, as I said, to deepen those relationships. Compare and contrast that to the business owner in their 60s or 70s or 80s right now that have accumulated more wealth than they can spend or want to spend or feel more comfortable spending. And they're keeping this wealth secret. And yet, going back to the number one issue that we talked about, opened this up with healthcare, we are hoping for great healthcare from the very people we're keeping secrets about our wealth from. I don't get it. If our intention is to leave wealth to people, why wouldn't we tell them?
Yeah.
I think that's going to show up in the quality and the quantity of healthcare that we hope to achieve from people who matter most in our lives. Who is that? Our children, our hope, the emissaries that will continue our life's work, our values.
Yeah. And again, Tom, you have a great sentence in your book, Willing Wisdom. Silence is the greatest destroyer of family wealth and family relationships. How can people start this conversation? I mean, everybody's a little bit afraid of saying, to their 10-year-old, we're worth $7.5 million or 7.5 or 15 or whatever. And having that kid take it to school. I can feel that inside me. Okay. For instance, a lot of business owners have a lot of net worth that's tied up in their businesses. They may be cash poor and land rich or business rich. Mm-hmm. They may have several businesses, and it doesn't feel like a quote unquote wealthy family. I have never met a truly wealthy family that felt like they were wealthy. Okay. Yeah. They were always talking about the issues, the cash flows, the things like that are business related.
I think it also comes from, in our busy life today, at least with families having that traditional once a week at minimum, a dinner, and maybe mom and dad are sitting around talking. I look back at, my own upbringing, and those dinners were places that things got discussed. And in mom and dad, business owner, for example, both parents working in the business, those discussions happened at the dinner table. Some of that has been removed from our modern culture to a certain extent. So Dan asks a good question. How do you do that? And it has to be intentional. I think this is the point you're making, is intentional communication about these issues prevents the litigation so that all the siblings know what's going on. Is that basically the message you're trying to deliver in your book?
Absolutely. And unlike renovating our home, which can be a classic do-it-yourself, go to the store, pick up some lumber, buy a hammer, some nails, and kind of work away on it, kind of do it yourself. Not this subject. What I'm really talking about is the importance of families relying on advisors like yourself to sit down with the family. Like, we know that if families try to navigate this on their own, they'll probably not go forward and do it in the first place, or two, it'll spin out of control because it just feels emotional. But by having that independent third party who has, the proper, education, certification, knows how to keep a meeting right, bring that kind of discipline, an agenda, meeting minutes, like, that's kind of what we're talking about governance. It's a good culture. And when families bring that discipline, but that openness and transparency and the professionalism to their wealth that they've worked so hard to build and create, when they do that next piece, which is bring their advisor to help prepare the next generation for the transition of wealth. You know what I'm describing? It's like the Rockefellers. That's what they did. That's why there's Rockefellers to this day that are starting new businesses and doing interesting things, because the wealth was put into perspective at a really early age. It was taught. They went to great lengths to teach the next generation that inherited wealth comes with tremendous responsibility and accountability. That it's not just about consumption. It's about investing and building wealth for the next generation and the next and the next and the next. And when you build that family culture with your advisors in the room, now that's how successful dynastic families are built. One generation at a time, setting up the next generation to be not just as good, but even better. Now that's a great gift to yourself and to your family.
Yeah, and I do love the fact that you've added planning to your list, passing on wisdom as well as wealth. I think that's critical. So let's talk a little bit about estate plans and share the one special element that successful families always keep front and center in their estate plan.
I think the really successful families they resist the temptation of dying and then just the floodgates open, and then their own children, who are typically in their 40s or 50s or 60s, because mom and dad have died in their 90s, 80s, or 70s, they resist the temptation of just hoarding their wealth, as you said, in their businesses or in their estate. And then just, as I said, boom, all at once, this money comes crashing down on the next generation, and they lack the tools to deal with it. I think if you watch the most successful families, what they're doing is they're starting to transition wealth while they're still alive.
Mm-hmm.
And not only are they transitioning wealth, it's relatively small and relatively infrequent gifts. But as they're getting older, the gifts are getting bigger and
Mm-hmm.
more frequent. But they're coaching, right? They're introducing their advisors to the next generation and teaching the next generation how to become investors, how to master the idea of spending less than you make. Well, there's a crazy idea for a new generation. How about the power of compounding interest? Like simple things, but things that are taught and reinforced. And I think the most successful families are doing that. They're transitioning and they're using living gifts, which are tax-free, right? And they're teaching more and reinforcing those important personal finance lessons. And it's patient and it's careful and it's cautious. And remember, not everything goes well. So when they're making small gifts and they can see that someone's got an addiction, that can inform their larger estate planning decisions. Maybe they are using trusts, right? You see how the living can use estate planning to engage in real issues in real time today.
Yeah, I agree. One of the things too that I always talk to my families about, a lot of times the frustration comes in where I try to transfer some of this information to my kids, they just don't get it. And I have to sit back with the owner or the couple and say, how long did it take you to gather that wisdom? And now you're expecting to transfer it overnight. It just simply doesn't work that way. You talked about 55 family meetings, okay, where you hear things over and over and over. The same values are shared consistently, the same idea of what success means, those kind of things.
Yeah.
And I think it's natural for us as business owners to want to get it off our plate, move on, transfer it. You got it, and we'll go on from there. The
Yeah.
process of education is tough.
Oh. Yeah, in our family meetings, Dan, we weren't spared bad stuff, the challenging issues that were going on in our family businesses. I don't want to leave you the impression it's just been up, and smooth and easy. We were in manufacturing, going back 100 years, distribution, chemical manufacturing, plastic manufacturing. I mean, there were some brutal, brutal years. And I think the gift that we received was that we were never spared those details. It wasn't like, well, you just attend the meetings where our advisors are going to present our return on our investments that were fantastic this year. We don't want you to hear the hard stuff. We saw it all. We were never asked to leave the room. We saw the good years, the challenging years, and that informed our view of what wealth is and what it isn't. And we worked hard. And I think those values were imparted formally through those family meetings, continuously through life and family dinners and all sorts of interactions. But I just think that the great gifts that we received was the context. There's no fast money. There's no easy money. We're grinders. We work hard. Even though we have created wealth, we're workers. We work and we save and we invest. Mm-hmm. And we make sure that those core values are part of the family conversations, part of the content of our family meetings.
Right. Tom, when you guys had your family meetings, and maybe we talked about this in prior sessions, but when you talk about the advisors being present, can you give us the types of advisors that are present at those meetings? Who, and then often as things shift and change, how did your family determine who's on the team?
Well, I think, first of all, there are not as many advisors as I would like to see on doing these family meetings. It's a very, very honed skill set, right? You're part of the Legacy Network, so you've received advanced training on how to deal with families and start and shape and facilitate and record these family conversations. So first of all, it's not a commodity. There just aren't a lot of you around, which probably is an explanation of why we have 127 million people missing will. I mean, there are lots of you out there. This wouldn't be such a big problem, an overwhelming problem. But I think that the families that I think reach out and do the research and find people they're comfortable with, and I think the advisors, look, no advisor has every tool in their toolbox. Like some advisors will still, bring in professional facilitators, or wherever they may have a gap in their skill set, they'll round that out by inviting someone in. Advisors will also bring in other resources like lawyers or accountants or other types of professionals when that makes sense. So it's not about one advisor having every answer to every question. It's about advisors saying, no, I think we're at the point in this family's evolution where we need some advanced tax advice. And so they'll bring in someone to make a presentation to the entire family. And I just think that when families really bring that conversation and show how much effort is being made to bring the transparency, to protect, we're talking about wealth protection. We're not talking about family meetings being designed to how families can talk about making more money. We're talking about families that have made money. And making money is hard. Keeping it is vastly harder.
Exactly.
It's way harder to keep it and transition it than to make it in the first place. And I think that's a big point that I think once you dive into family meetings and bring the right people around the table to get the plans in place and communicated and everyone on the same page, stripping away the scenario or the possibility that when someone dies, and everyone does, that there's no surprises. Seriously, in our family, when my parents die, there will be lots of grieving, but there will be no surprises. I have a copy of my parents' will, power of attorney, healthcare directive. I have all the documents, as do my brother. We are co-executive. We have the gift that they are giving us is that certainty of how we should proceed. as opposed to my brother and I being in a hospital hallway trying to battle or fight over, whether we should plug or unplug, resuscitate, do not resuscitate. Like that is it's already been decided and communicated and discussed over and over and over.
I think that's so critical too, Tom, because when we talk to our families,
Yep.
it typically comes down to, well, they need to know how to run this thing. Okay, I got that. But you also need to know how to manage it and how to control what's going on around the shell of the business, because people are the main asset in the business. If they're not there, and I mentioned this early, capable of making decisions and able to, because of knowledge and wisdom that's been passed along earlier, it makes a big difference. You talk about governance a lot, and governance sounds awfully formal and legal. So let's talk a little bit more about what you mean by government or governance, and talk about, is it my legal will, power of attorney, healthcare directives, or are we talking about 100-year vision for my family?
Well, the quick answer, both. So I talked about very briefly about how I have my parents' documents, all of them.
Right.
We know exactly where they are. If they're ever changed, we're part of that. We get updated copies. We're co-executive. And by the way, nothing says a die in order. So my parents have my documents.
Right.
Yeah.
Our kids, we got adult kids, 28, 26, they have copies of our documents. So governance is the papering, right? All those important documents not only are being drafted, but discussed, revised, and shared. So that's good governance. But we also have a family mission statement, and we're constantly at the very beginning of our meetings reading that family mission statement, reminding us why we are meeting. And sometimes we're tweaking that, not very much, because we've been at this such a long time that family mission statement is pretty much hard baked in our culture. And in that family mission statement is, again, reference to confidentiality, but also what our dreams and aspirations are for even the unborn. And part of our core values is, and you won't be surprised having read my first book, Every Family's Business, if part of our vision is to create a family culture that gives enough space and freedom and flexibility for the next generation to go forward with our wealth and really become the people they're meant to be, to pursue things and ambitions that may be very different from ours. So that is kind of hard baked into our family culture. And that's very different from the business family who doesn't speak, doesn't have family meetings, have built a really nice business. And because there's no conversation, everyone is left with the immutable idea that their job is to become a version of the business founder. And if they don't, then somehow they'll be disinherited or be left out of the business succession plan or the estate plan. So everyone has been co-opted or incentivized to feign interest or passion that actually is not authentic. And that's incredibly dangerous. And the data points, right? 90% of businesses in America are family owned and controlled, and only 3% will make it to grandchildren. So that's a 97% wealth destruction piece of data that should be alarming, and it is alarming. So really, I just think we're just offering a different take in our family, which is we created wealth. Tire distribution in the 1920s, chemical manufacturers in the 50s, plastic, now publishing. Guess what, guys? In our family meeting, we've asked our two kids if they want to continue my business. They've said no. Shockingly, they have their own interest, passion, and
how dare they, right?
Yeah.
I just think we're just like, but that doesn't say, well, if you don't want to be a publisher and a speaker and an author like your father, well, then you're not getting any of my money. It's like, no. Well, what are you interested in? And what are your dreams? And how much would that, how much capital do you need now to start a business? And how could you scale it? Like, what are your plans? And so we don't deny the next generation capital, working capital. We engage in those conversations and we flow the money while we're still alive. I mean, don't you want to see what your money does? Why do we want to hoard it to the end? And I think really, really astute advisors can kind of open up that conversation and do really extraordinary work for families.
I agree. I really do. And it's a tough, and Kevin, we run into this all the time.
Yeah, I was talking about that today in a meeting I was at, prior to this, and the first time in over a year and a half, traffic was in the equation, which is why I was walked up the stairs after you guys got started. But the legacy of family business or businesses in general, those conversations about what is the next phase, how will that be handled, who participates in the business, all those types of things. I am sure, because you're just talking about in your own family, what the kids want to do. They may not participate in your business that you're doing now, but they'll participate in another business. That's perfectly fine. But it's not until you have that plan laid down that says, here's how that happens. And here's some of the criteria, it generally gets to be a mess. And that's been my experience. And I can definitely see the message here today is, these are all the components of things that we need to touch base on. It's a good list.
Right. And before we get too far into this, because we are getting close on time, I just want to encourage everybody who's listening to email us and give us your email. We'll send you copies of Every Family's Business and Willing Wisdom. I have to tell you, I tell all my business clients that, you have to be informed. These are both very easy reads, but full of very good, easy to understand information. And they are in the top 5 books that every business owner should read.
Yep.
For no other reason than to maintain a good shop, to keep things housekeeping, to make sure that, the transfer of wealth can be a very emotional thing, or it can be a very logical, well-built, understood, just a nice way to have families continue. Just because you are in manufacturing doesn't mean that you don't have a child who wants to be a teacher. Encouraging that vision is something you can do with your wealth. And I encourage all of our business owners just to take a couple of hours and read these books. I mean, it will make a huge difference in the way that you see things. I want to talk a little bit about the complexity and emotional issues in transferring wealth after you read the books. Fair is not always equal, and equal is not always fair. So what do we do if we say we're a farmer and we have 3 children, 2 that are just love farming. So that's easy. We can leave the farms to them. How do we separate assets when we know that we have individuals inside the family and there always are others? How do we transfer that? I mean, I'm a financial planner. I have a son who's in the music business. My daughter is deep into the education and to different things. So she publishes papers. I barely can read papers. Okay. How do we encourage there is no child to transfer my business to. They're not interested in it, just like yours. How do we talk to our children about handling this wealth transfer?
Well, I think we approach those family conversations from a place of what you just said, which is, I don't have the answers, and I'd like to start a conversation and get your input. Like, there's always been this idea that if we're considering our will, we got to sit down and we got to sit alone and come up with the perfect estate plan. And part of what I'm trying to do is flip that and say, how about going to that family meeting and saying, I got to update my will. Your mother and I have to update our will. But we don't know what we don't know. And we're wondering what you guys think. You see the shift in power, and it's almost like a little bit of a dress rehearsal, getting ready for the children who will probably one day be in charge of our healthcare, right? So we're actually getting out in front of that and saying, like, we have to update our will and we need to select an executor or executors. And instead of us just arbitrarily in the comfort of our own home, in secret, appointing you and not telling you, we're going to just we just want to talk about it. Like, what do you guys think? What do you guys want? One of you, both of you, none of you? We could use a professional trustee. Like, what? Let's have a conversation and make this decision together. Do you feel the shift in power from I've got all the money,
Right.
so I got to have all the answers,
Right.
and I've got to get this perfect and do it all on my own in secret. It seldom works well. And I just think that the big dividend is right where we started, which is our healthcare. When we trust people to talk about our money, the people we intend to leave our wealth to, when we trust them with not only our money, but conversations about those money, we are creating the preconditions for those people to give us great care. It's logical. It's such a smart thing to do. And it's counterintuitive, right? Because
Absolutely.
the other approach is I'm going to keep my wealth secret, and whoever treats me the best may get more in my will. Oh, yeah. Good luck with that one.
Yeah, that always works well.
Yeah.
Right.
Good luck with that one.
That's right. Kevin, we're a little short on time, but
Yeah.
what's the one question you would ask Tom? Reading his 2 books and using them in the field and
Yeah.
seeing your families. What's the one question you want to ask Tom?
I think that it really is the theme overall. So after we've gone through this series, what led you to write these books? What was the driving force to write these books?
That is a really tricky question to answer, but let me approach it this way. I think any author who writes a decent book is trying to convince themselves of an idea. They're not trying to convince the readers. When I wrote both books, I was struggling with this idea that we had never given our businesses to our kids.
Mm-hmm.
We've never done what the world or the literature says is a successful transition, measured by generations. 4th generation family business is way more successful than a third. Third is way more successful than a second. And yet here we are. Tire distribution business was sold in the 1940s, chemical manufacturing in the 90s, plastics, 2007. Publishing, I'll tell you, it's going to be sold. We've never transitioned to business. So I thought, I've got to write a different book. I've got to convince myself that our family isn't a complete disaster, that in fact, it feels pretty successful. That in fact, my publishing company is a 4th generation family business. The fact that it's not selling tires, making chemicals, making plastics, it could not have existed without the prior efforts, ingenuity, savings, all of the things, the struggles of 3 generations that preceded me. A family business is not a building with your name on it. It is a set of values, a love of entrepreneurship that is passed from one generation to the next. Those were the most valuable gifts that transitioned across the generations to create my business. And I felt this duty not just to transition those values to my own kids, but also to a much broader public that has been left with a different idea. And that is, if you don't transition the business, you're a failed family.
Right.
I don't believe it.
I think that's a really a great answer, and it gives our audience a different perspective overall, because the expectation that maybe you're going to come to today's program and get all these technical widgets of how to do this, soup to nuts. That's a 15-hour conversation, but really what we're doing is we're framing the thought process of how to think about this.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really the goal that, I wanted to achieve with this effort. And, I really think that really understanding the why behind why you wrote those books will help our audience and the people who listen to these webinars really embrace the message, which is fantastic.
Well, I really appreciate that, Kevin. And of course, you will know that, both books include questions. In other words, my family transition plan for both businesses and wealth is going to be very different from yours. And the subject really eludes the cookie cutter approach, right? So that's why I use questions. the questions that mom and dad can ask their kids, kids can ask their parents, the answers to the question and the solution for that family resides somewhere in that space between mom and dad
Mhm.
and the kids. And it's different in every family. So I just believe in that kind of approach. It's a Socratic approach. Socrates would debate by asking questions, not answering them, right?
Right.
And it is an approach that really helps families arrive at the solution that is right for them and unique for them.
Right.
And if that solution, when it's been built intentionally and purposefully with the help of advisors in a room with trust and love and mutual respect and great communication, those are awesome families. They're awesome.
Right, yeah, we're kind of running a little short on time, Tom. I would encourage anybody who's listening to raise their hand, and we will unmute them if they do have a question. So let's give folks just a few seconds here to see if we have any questions from other folks. So if you'll raise your hand on your Zoom screen, we'll unmute you to ask questions.
I think we have one. We have a hand raised. David?
Hi,
Go ahead,
guys.
David, you're unmuted.
This is an amazing conversation. And that leads me to ask, how do you initiate this kind of conversation with your clients or with the people that you're dealing with?
I think, well, so a couple of statistics are really important. Not that you ever want your conversation to be just mired in data, but I think when people understand the cost of dying intestate, dying without a will, the cost in taxation, lost opportunities to put in place really good plans, the lack of liquidity, the lack of insurance to pay tax bills, leaving that liability to the next generation. Those are great places to start, but there is one better place to start that will lead to answers to those questions. And that is, I tell advisors all the time, don't leave home without it. That's my will. It's my will. Do you know how many millions of Americans have never seen a will? They have no idea what you're talking about. And they're so afraid. There's so much fear around this subject. When we can de-escalate that fear by making, it's like, hey, read my will. It just says that if I die first, my wealth goes to my wife dies, the wealth goes to our kids. Like, it's no big deal. This is what it looks like. I can help you get organized. I can introduce you to an attorney. They can help you get organized. Now, there's no money to be made for the advisor there, but it just takes the fear out of this subject. And I just think that is important work for advisors, just showing people how easy it is, and then how great it feels to be organized, knowing that we've got things in place, and then that's just part of it's just part of responsible parenting as well. That's just a great way to do it. And if you're struggling to start this conversation with your own parents, we always think that we die in order. We don't. There's lots of Americans today that will predecease their parents. Giving our parents a copy of our will often create that reciprocity. Parents will often reciprocate and give their kids a copy of a will. It's a little bit weird when we parent our parents on a subject, right, where we think they should be leading. But I just think that's a great way for starting family conversations. You got to remember, parents whose parents didn't have a will often die intestate. It's called family systems theory. We repeat family culture. We repeat mistakes made by previous generations. We also repeat great things. But if parents die intestate, we know statistically that the kids will often place no premium on having a will. So my call to action is actually for some generation to break that cycle of indifference and to put their estate plans in place and share them with their parents to help get them organized and overcome their fear of aging and dying.
Great. Kelly, do we have any more questions? let's take one more shot and see if someone has a question. Oh, go ahead. Is it Danielle? Yeah, Danielle, go ahead.
Yes, it is. Thank you. And Tom, thank you so much for sharing what you've shared here today. I'm going into my intuition here of very often I found that this topic doesn't get looked at because of that fear of entitlement. How do you deal with the whole concept of entitlement to even start the conversation?
Great question, Danielle. Well, here's the thing. That sense of entitlement, if I was to die today and I felt that I had entitled kids and I didn't want to talk to them about money, if I were to die today, explain to me how that entitlement disappears. It's just that I'm not here to see it. So part of what I'm saying about raising children where we're concerned about that entitlement is to deal with it, is to educate it, is to coach it. And ultimately, if we cannot find ways to teach children, because look, there are some generations and some children that just, I don't know, they just feel like it's theirs. Then there are technical solutions that our advisors can put in place to deal with children, for example, who have spending problems or addiction problems. They're called trusts. And we usually use them when there is a lack of
Trust.
Yes. Yeah. So if that's a serious concerns around entitlement, sometimes people over time can resolve these issues. People get better, they get healthy, and sometimes trust, if they're built, structured the proper way, money can flow. But if there's serious concerns, just by not dealing with this does not make the problem go away. All we're doing is kicking the can down the road.
More questions.
Mm-hmm. One thing that helps in that area, Danielle and Tom, that we do is encourage families to talk about philanthropy and start small and encourage their teenagers, young adults, little kids to talk about the charities they want to support and give them some of the funds necessary to do that. And that starts to build that conversation. But all the studies show that philanthropy is a great way to deal with the entitlement issue, but it's a huge issue. It's a huge issue.
A huge issue.
Yeah.
So we only have just a couple more minutes, Tom, and I don't mean to cut you off, but I'd like to see if there's any more questions at all. We have time for one more.
Thanks, Danielle.
Thank you very much, Danielle. Very good subject. Kelly? Okay.
No other questions?
All right, Tom. Well, I do appreciate your time. And again, I want to reinforce that the books are available. They're free to whoever's listening. All we need is your email, so we have some place to send it to. We want to make sure we have hard copies, so we'll be happy to mail them out to you. So if you, in your email, if you'll give us a good mailing address, we'll make sure you get copies of them. And Tom, I just can't say enough, and thank you enough for your time.
Mm-hmm.
And I would encourage everyone, if you're an advisor and you're on here, you need to be talking to your clients about Tom and his books. It will help the conversation. It will help guide through it. If you're a business owner and you're listening to us, please read these books. You're talking a couple of hours of time. It could even be during your downtime. Maybe skip a TV movie and read these books. It's critical. And it's very, very easy. Tom, I can't thank you enough.
Yeah, Tom, this has been a great series. So we thank you very much for your time and participation.
Well, thanks for having me, gentlemen, and continue to do the great work you're doing in your community. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, Tom, thank you.
All righty. Thank you very much. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.